Marilyn, for having me be a part of this panel. In her article, Education, Multiculturalism, and Anti-Racism, Deborah Bradley poignantly asks, can we talk? She points to the silence that surrounds issues of race and racism in music education, and to the coded language that masks these issues in discourse, citing silence, fear, and discomfort as motivators of the avoidance of direct language. In the now more frequent calls for diversity and social justice in music education, it is increasingly apparent that when our field is asked to speak of race, that we begin to speak in euphemisms. As a field, when we talk of race, we clothe it in what Angelina Castagno calls neutral concepts, discussion that includes similarities and differences, cultural factors, and learning styles. We issue open directives such as adapt curriculum, teaching strategies, and develop strategic plans. In doing so, we offer vague concepts to purportedly address an issue, inequity, that is specific, concrete, and pervasive. Pervasive silence surrounds the subject of race in music education, an issue that is simultaneously systemic and embedded in human actions. Ladson Billings asserts, I want to examine the ways that race, a social construct with powerful social and political implications, has been muted in the current multicultural paradigm or pitted against other subjectivities, particularly class and gender, to render it undiscussable as a difference or a site of struggle. The idea of race as undiscussable emerges repeatedly in the literature. Mika Pollock identifies the phenomenon as color muteness, arguing that despite the often good intentions of those who do not speak of race, the mechanism of color muteness works to institutionalize whiteness as a dominant ideology. Color muteness relates directly to color blindness, and in some ways as color blindness' operationalization. Mazai contends that, quote, as whites, we learn over time not to talk about race, especially whiteness, or more importantly, how to talk about race by not talking about it. Further, as women, we are carefully taught that our role, in fact our duty, is in many instances to maintain peace, maintain silence, to smooth the rough edges, and to provide a calm surface that belies the raging waters underneath. Silence, then, is complicated. It is resplendent with good intentions. When we do talk of race as a discipline, we use coded language, discourses of colorblindness, and the myth of the meritocracy. We use words like urban, at-risk, and diversity to mean something very specific, yet we mask the classed and race nature of these terms and cloak them in politeness, niceness, and good intentions. The classical music and post-secondary music education sphere is further complicated by what Bourgeois terms terminal naivete. Terminal naivete describes a lack of awareness of power relations, larger global dynamics, and an individualistic focus on self-improvement, often associated with classical musicians. Bourgeois describes the state as, quote, a mode of being in which individuals are constantly engaged in forms of self-improvement, divorced from any sense of the systems of governmentality that shape our and other people's lives, end quote. Effectively, terminal naivete describes the intent to stay unaware or disinterested in world events and the systems that shape our society. In the context of terminal naivete, there is an implied political disinterestedness too often present in the classical music world. Silence and disinterestedness is thus a part of our discipline. It is intertwined with our musician-teacher beings and operates powerfully in the world. However, given the recent events at the National Association for Music Education that led to the resignation of Michael Butera, it is clearly time for our field to step out of the realm of terminal naivete and stop talking in euphemisms such as diversity and social justice. We need to bravely start identifying issues of oppression that prevent us from moving forward. Music education currently operates through an ideology of white supremacy. When I moved to the US, I stopped talking about white supremacy and started talking about whiteness and white privilege. I discovered I was less likely to be shut down if I did not quite say what I meant. As a discipline, we need to start naming systems. I define white supremacy drawing on the work of Mills as a system of domination or racial contract that systemically and structurally privileges white people and subjugates others both discursively and materially. The racial contract upholds what Mills identifies as the unnamed political structure present in the world today, global white supremacy. When I talk about white supremacy, I do not mean the Ku Klux Klan. That's a manifestation. Rather, I refer to a societal system and an ideology that is self-perpetuating. In many ways, traditional music education reinscribes the dominant ruling ideology of white supremacy. The teacher-centered Western ensemble paradigm is the dominant paradigm of North American music education. It frequently privileges technique over musicality and the cognitive over the playful. Curriculum content typically follows a replication model as opposed to a creativity model. Western notation supersedes oral transmission. While students conforming to this narrow paradigm are validated, other students, frequently students of color, are frequently pushed out of music. This pushing out occurs through validating practices that privilege Eurocentric epistemologies while devaluing skills associated with Black music, such as improvisation, oral tradition, and movement. Institutions place value, for example, on still comportment and listening and performing music, on Western standard notation and Western elements of music, and limit oral learning to acceptable forms of orality, such as teaching by rote, ideas that are antithetical to musical practices in the majority of cultures outside of the Western classical musical sphere. In the coded and liberal discourse of music education, we fail to face the thundering whiteness of our field. Yet how do we begin to break the silence when, quote, ignoring race is understood to be a graceful, even generous liberal gesture? That's Toni Morrison. As a discipline, how do we begin to reveal the whiteness of music education? In rendering race undiscussable, the mirror we hold up to our discipline reflects only euphemisms, vague notions of diversity that mask systemic issues. Steeped in notions from neoliberalism, music education advocacy discourses foster the idea that every child can do music and that music is a fundamental aspect of a child's education, a strategic discursive move that attempts to secure the place of music in schools. However, when we deploy these discourses, we fail to recognize that music education is far from neutral. We must begin to ask questions. If every child can do music, whose music do we mean? Which traditions? Which instruments? Then more powerfully, we might ask who is not present in our classes, our programs, our curriculum, our pedagogy. We must learn to speak in systems and power rather than in euphemisms. Current discourses about inclusion, about drawing people into the circle that is music education who may not typically participate. Inclusive discourse, however, as Elizabeth Gould so accurately illuminates, is problematic. As we include more people and groups in education, we do not change the core body of the discipline. When we work, for example, to diversify our ensembles and do so successfully, music education is not somehow less white. Furthermore, when music education draws in people from marginalized groups, these individuals may in fact remain marginalized in our discipline, or worse, be put in a position of holding up a mirror to music education and teaching our field about its own whiteness. Instead, we must become self-reflexive and move beyond notions of inclusion to deep systemic questions. In a beautiful paper presented at last year's NAFME conference in Atlanta, Tammy Draves called on our profession to think about the unbearable whiteness of music education. She drew upon Peggy McIntosh's famous work on white privilege and mapped some of McIntosh's statements clearly into our field. As I listened in the packed room, a standing room only room of people wanting to hear about whiteness in music education, the word unbearable struck me as not quite right. The unbearable whiteness of music education implies a lack of agency, a sentiment along the lines of we cannot bear it, but we also cannot fix it. As Draves elucidated compellingly, as others have before her, music education is steeped in whiteness. I assert that we must reframe this unbearability and put forward the notion of the intolerable whiteness of music education. Intolerance is interpolation. It interpolates us to act. Acting begins with naming, identifying systems clearly and moving to dismantle them. As a field, if we are genuinely interested in what we call diversity, we must foreground issues of race, whiteness, and power and act accordingly. We do not need to invite more people to the table that is music education. We have to recognize the table for all its ideologies and institutional powers, and then we need to throw away the table and shape a different way forward. For as long as we have a core to what music education is and does, we will never be able to address the intolerable whiteness that is music education.